Okay guys, let's get started. Let's get started with this lecture today about the whole and the parts. The whole and the parts, so that's sort of the name of this. But before I start, one good news, one bad news. The good news is I think I figured out the way the recording, I think I solved the technical glitches in a way, so hopefully by now we should have it all sorted out. The other thing, the bad side is keep in mind we have the first quiz coming up, like the first assessed quiz. I think it's at the end of next week. Don't nail me down, but I mentioned that. And keep in mind it's about the readings. So I will ask you very detailed questions about the readings. Why am I doing this? To keep you on the top of the readings, because otherwise you are fucked at the end of the term, right? So basically that's the idea. So keep that in mind. And then also, but I'm going to mention that again on Tuesday. I already mentioned it last time. Next week we have Peter Hedstrom visiting the School of Sociology. So on Wednesday afternoon at 5 o'clock, you're very welcome. Actually, you're always welcome to come to the Sociology seminar series. And Peter Hedstrom, he's sort of one of the founding fathers of analytical sociology. So he's the dude in this field. Okay, so let's get started with the whole and the parts. So but before we do that, a little fun question that I have for you right now. I was a little late, as I said. Normally I like to be here early and see actually how you guys walk in, but I would like to know that now. There's no right or wrong answer here. This is really just for us to get started with some of the things we want to talk about today. Okay, I will come back to that later on, but what you can see right now already, there are a whole bunch of different motivations here. The thing that I want to get onto in the second part of the lecture and also in the subsequent lectures is you see some people just wanted to sit next to somebody, right? And then you see some other people didn't want to sit in the front or they want to sit in the back. So and now you can imagine what happens if you are one of those persons who just want to sit next to somebody, but the person you want to sit next to had the idea to sit in the back, right? So you end up sitting in the back too, right? So that's sort of like how dynamics can unfold. And there's this guy, Thomas Schelling, I had mentioned him a few times, this is a Nobel Prize winner. He wrote this beautiful book, Micromotives and Macro Behavior. And you can easily read it, and I think over 10 pages he thinks about why do people sit where they sit when he gives a talk. And then he thinks through all these different possibilities and all the dynamics that could follow from that. And how the things that we observe then actually also end up in, where we end up in situations because of these kind of dynamics that maybe none of us actually wanted in the first instance. Yeah? So I think here now in this lecture theater is fine, but sometimes the acoustics really suck at this university, and then everybody could be better off by just sitting one seat, one row further down, right? You would still be at the very end, right? If that is sort of what is driving your thing, or you would still be sitting next to everybody else in a way, and this sort of can lead to situations where individually we want something and collectively we achieve the opposite of it. Yeah. These are called social dilemma situations, but we'll come back to them later on. But for now, if there's one message I want you to take out of this lecture today, it's this. It's really that the whole is other than the sum of the parts. Now, this is now in a very abstract, airy-fairy way, but hopefully it becomes clearer afterwards. So we are sociologists. We are interested in societal level phenomena. in things that that concern the society and so on. But now, and hopefully you get that point that I'm kind of banging on in this lecture here, that the whole is not always just the sum of the parts. I think that's the very reason why we are interested in sociology. Yeah. If it would be the case that 1 + 2 is always 2, actually, what's the point of us being here? We would just have to understand how individuals behave or what individuals do. But it becomes really interesting when this is not the case. Yeah? And this is sort of where the idea of fallacies come into play, where you need to understand that the whole and the parts, you need to separate these things from each other. Yeah? And you need to be very aware of what you are at this moment looking at. Because if you don't, you might really just screw it up. I have some examples where you can draw very wrong conclusions when you go down that route and don't think about that. Yeah. So this is sort of the stuff that I brought with me today. So first I want to talk about fallacies, or more precisely I want to talk about the ecological fallacy. Some of you might have heard about that before. It really is, what is our unit of analysis? What is the level? What is the level that we are studying something? And essentially it says when you're studying the one level, you cannot draw conclusions about the other level. You need to stay on that level. Sounds very straightforward. Yeah? It sounds really straightforward, but it's a mistake that people make all the time. And you see it in the news all the time, where people say, okay, this is sort of how a country looks like, this is sort of this is how individuals are, right? Or this is how individuals are, this is sort of how a country looks like. It's a mistake that people make all the time, but as social scientists, you shouldn't make that mistake. You should be aware of it. Okay, so that's fallacies, and afterwards I want to talk about social dynamics, which is sort of flipping it around, while the ecological fallacy looks at from the top to the bottom. The social dynamics part there, I want you to look the other direction in a bit of a way, like we observe a macro level pattern, or we know individuals, and the pattern that comes out of it might not necessarily be that straightforward either. Why? Because of the social dynamics that are involved in it. And in that context, I also brought a little bit with me about the tragedy of the commons. No idea if we get there, but it's about these social dilemma situations, where collectively we really screw it up, although individually we try to do our best. Yeah? But I have no idea if you're going to get to that. So probably, sometimes I just bring too much stuff, and then I realize, okay, maybe this is too much for you. Okay, so let's talk about fallacies. And let's backtrack a little bit. So, as we had it last lecture as well, or last week, as social scientists, as sociologists, we are often interested in these macro level patterns. Now I'm speaking very broadly, but like things like segregation, network structures, norms, typical beliefs, ways of acting, or it could be even something more applied, like unemployment rate in Ireland, or a suicidal rate in some countries, or other things that we look at macro level patterns here. You see how this is a macro level pattern? This is not about why does an individual have a certain idea about how to behave, but why is there something like a general norm? Or it's not about why is a particular individual unemployed, it's about why is there an unemployment rate in that country. And you might think, okay, hang on a moment, but these things are so connected with each other, isn't that sort of the same? Well, hopefully after that lecture you realize that they are not necessarily the same. And you need to be very careful in making that distinction. What is macro? What is sort of the societal level pattern that you're looking at? And what are the lower level units? And some lower level units that we have, let's face it, we do have individuals. So these are sort of the most important micro level actors that we have. Individuals, they form populations, they do something, right, and together they exhibit a certain macro level pattern. But the point is, we need to be careful about what we are doing. Are we looking up? So are we looking at these broader macro level patterns? Is that sort of what we're studying? Is that our unit of analysis? And this is sort of where the ecological fallacy comes into play, because people actually have that as unit as analysis, and then they pretend that their unit of analysis is the individual, right? Or the other way around. So are we looking up? Are we looking at the societal phenomena, macro level patterns, or are we looking down at the individuals? And hopefully I convince you that even when you see, so you can see the whole thing. You know, I have this idea of the whole of the car. You know, you can see the whole thing, and you do not necessarily know. Maybe you see it drives, but you have no clue what is happening in there. You have no clue what the elements in there, or why it sometimes doesn't work, and so on. While on the other side, you can take it apart. You can look at all the parts, and you have no clue what this thing does. Right? If you wouldn't know that this is now a car, you see a lot of different components in there, and it might not necessarily tell you about what's coming out of it at the end of the day. Right? So it's really the whole and the parts. The whole and the parts are not the same, and I think this is sort of a nice motivation for sociology as a whole. Or at least for me, you know, in all my work, this is basically what's starting, or what I find actually interesting and useful. Yeah, because sometimes we all have that once in a while. We have these existential crises about what the hell are we doing. You know, I had that too, thinking about, okay, what am I doing? Sociology. Can I contribute something? Can I learn something that others cannot do in any better way? And I think the value added of sociology is precisely this. It's precisely this distinction between the macro and the micro, between the whole and the part, and to understand that the whole is sometimes other than the sum of the parts. There's something else that comes in here. You know? And by making this step from the micro to the macro, that's sort of the unique element, or actually also the other way down, but we'll talk more about that, I think, next week, about the micro and the macro linkages and so on. Also, when you go from the macro to the micro, and then when you go from the micro to the macro, like bridging these levels, I think this is sort of where the value added of sociology comes in. Or this is sort of where other disciplines are not that good at it. Or where as sociologists we can be really good at it. Yeah. Okay, so the whole and the parts, and you really need to think about what you are looking at. So let me get started with this idea of these fallacies. Yeah. Fallacies. Fallacies basically means like, I don't know, like a trap, something that you can easily make wrong. Yeah. Like a mistake. Okay, there are a whole bunch of fallacies that you can make, a bunch of logical fallacies. The one that I want to talk about today is called the ecological fallacy. Yeah? So fallacy is sort of a mistake, it's a trap you can walk to. And ecological, what does that mean? Well, basically it means like group level. Yeah? It's like a higher level thing. And what does it mean? Well, basically it just says when you have information or data on group levels on that thing, you know about, let's say, an unemployment rate in a certain country, then you cannot make analysis or draw conclusions about particular individuals in that group. Yeah? So when I know, for example, I have a whole bunch of examples that hopefully make that clear. Like when I know, the unemployment rate is high in a country, I cannot necessarily deduce from that you are unemployed. Because I don't have information about you. Yeah? I have only information about the country. And the ecological fallacy is, at the end of the day, when you mix up correlations, your correlations mean like the one thing goes up, then the other thing goes up, so things that you relate with each other. Yeah? You can relate macro-level phenomena with each other. You know, the classic thing, I think I had it last time, you can have Protestantism and capitalism. Yeah? There's Protestantism and there's capitalism, and these things sort of seem to go in tandem with each other. You make a link between them, you say yay, but the problem is when you confuse that relationship at the macro level with that relationship at the micro level. That's essentially an ecological fallacy. It's when you mix up your units of analysis. How can that be? You can have the group level, you know something about a group, and now I'm telling you, you cannot necessarily deduce something or draw conclusions about individuals in that group. Yeah? So if I say, for example, if I know, well, it's a kind of a classic example. I don't know about sports teams here. I'm so bad with that yet. Still have to figure that out. But let's say a famous sports team here. Let's say Dublin. I don't know. Dublin football is great. Yeah, they are. I think. Didn't they win the GAA 2 years ago? Last year? I can't remember. God, I'm so bad. And now the fallacy would be like you tell me you are a player for the Dublin team, and I say then you are amazing, without knowing anything about you. I just know something about the team. That would be a fallacy, because then I only have information about the group, right? And then based on that, I would say that without knowing you, that you can still be a sucky player in a good team. That's sort of basically what the fallacy is all about. It's about this one, I don't know, it's about individuals that are although the group has certain features, right, and to a certain degree the group consists of the individuals in there, but that doesn't mean that each individual has exactly the same quality as the group suggests. Some are shitty, some are probably better, I don't know. Yeah. But that's sort of this mistake where you kind of have different units of analysis, the group level and the individual level. Yeah. So there you have. So I have another example about how that goes, and hopefully this sort of makes it very clear. You know, like with these kind of things, with logical stuff, you have to give it to them. The Greeks, they almost figured everything out already. You know. So there's this classic example of this guy Thrasymachus. Don't ask me exactly where that is from. Yeah, but it's one of those Greek stories. This one guy says, my father-in-law is one of the smartest people I know. Yeah? And then sort of his friends, Adiamantus says, how so? And then this other guy says, well, he's from Athens. Yeah? And then the other guy says, well, people from Athens tend to be highly intelligent, but that does not mean every obi from there is intelligent. Yeah? You get the story? So because people tend to be intelligent from there, and maybe that's that people in Athens are just clever, or they used to be very clever, but that doesn't mean that everybody from there is from Athens. And the mistake would be, if you kind of draw from this limited knowledge that you have, that, I don't know, your father-in-law is from Athens, that he's then clever, just because he's from Athens. That's the ecological fallacy. Yeah? So you make wrong conclusions about individuals based on group level information that you have. And the group level information that we would have here is that people in Athens tend to be clever. You know? We don't have the information that Thrasymachus' father-in-law is clever. We don't have that information. And it's a fallacy to make that conclusion or to make that claim based on that group level information that we actually have. So that's an ecological fallacy. So I have a little exercise for you guys where I want to start you thinking about that a little bit. I want you to think about two possible scenarios where a similar mistake of confusing group, that's sort of what we call the ecological, and the individual level is being made. So just think about scenario, talk about that very briefly. Yeah? Okay, go. Okay, guys, I think so the few people I talked with had some great ideas. It really is about kind of mixing up these levels, yeah? And when you know something just about one level, when you know something about the group level, let's say, I don't know, then you cannot say something about particular individuals, yeah? So one example was, let's assume we have the information about that people who wear glasses tend to be more intelligent, yeah? And then, I don't know, I come along with my glasses on, and then you would say Thomas is intelligent. That's a fallacy, because you don't have that information. You don't know anything about me at this particular moment. Yeah? Let's say if I'm just a random individual walking in. Yeah? So the thing is, you make a fallacy when you kind of mix these levels up. And oftentimes, when you read the news, I was a little too late, so I started looking this morning for some examples in the news, but you find it there very often, where kind of there's a general statement, or oftentimes it's backed up with data about a country, for example, and then there are sort of claims made about individuals in that country that applies in exactly the same way. But I have 3 examples that I brought with me, so I'm going to walk you through these examples, and some of them actually should be familiar to you already. Yeah? So the first thing, it's this reading that you guys had for last week already. Was this paper by Berkeley and others about gender inequality and admissions in Berkeley. It was a science paper. This is a science, well, it's a little outdated now, but still, it's like science is sort of one of the best journal to get into. So, and what they did look in there, you don't have to be a hard scientist to end up in science. Actually, there's good social science stuff in there too. And by now, more and more people go down that route, and I think it's very, very good. So what they did in this study, they looked at the admission rates of males and female applicants to the University of California in Berkeley, yeah, in the 1970s. If you've ever been to Berkeley, it's a really nice place. I had a friend of mine, he was doing his PhD there, and I just wondered, how can you ever get anything done? Seriously, amazing weather, beautiful location. He said, Thomas, it's like this every day. I said, okay, I don't have that problem in Ireland. But so it was about the admission rates, and when you look at the raw data, this is sort of how the raw data looks like. Now this should ring familiar to you. This is what's in the readings. You have on the one axis you have male applicants and female applicants. On the other axis you see how many of them got admitted. Yeah. So from this number you would say, well, I didn't have how many got admitted at the end of the day, but it's basically just the percentage of that. So 44% of 8,442, that would be the males that got admitted to Berkeley. But what you see here is that the rate is higher for males than for females. Yeah? And actually it's also significant, but we don't care about that right now. So this number is higher. So it looks as if males get admitted more often. Yeah? That's how this looks like. But now when I kind of present you this data, when I dig in deeper, and this is sort of what they did in this paper, and now let's say, now here the data is split up for different departments, different schools. Yeah? So here they had the 6 biggest schools that they had, with the number of applicants and number of the admission rate for both males and for females. And now I highlighted the ones that kind of were higher in red again. And what you see now is that now in 4 out of these 6 departments, actually women got admitted more. It's exactly the same population. But now suddenly it looks like the relationship reversed. Now it actually looks like females get admitted more often. Yeah? I didn't do any magic here. I just zoomed down one layer. Right? Before I kind of, just gave you this information about the general university level. Now I kind of gave you information about a lower level in order so that you can see that you can have vastly different interpretations of this. Yeah? Or kind of it looks very different. In one case it looks like when I'm on the higher level, it looks like males get admitted more often, while at the lower level, with the same people in there and generating that data, it looks like females get admitted more often. So this is a paradox. This is sort of a paradox. Actually, this is an example of what we call the Simpsons paradox. Not after the Simpsons, but after a statistician called Simpsons. And it seems that male applicants get admitted more often, but when looking at departments separately, it seems that female applicants get admitted more often. How can that be? That's a little fishy. That's a little odd. While the solution to this is relatively straightforward, the solution here is, well, we looked at different kinds of levels here. We looked at a higher level, and we looked sort of like this lower meso level in between with the departments. And if you would look at that, then we would see that some departments have a lower acceptance rate than others. That's just how it is. And females tend to apply to these departments with lower acceptance rates. Or that's how it used to be in the 70s at Berkeley. Now the situation might be different, but that's sort of how it was at the time. More precisely, it was a bit like this, that females tended to apply more to the English department than to the mechanical engineering department. But back in the days, mechanical engineering department were almost always males. And at the time, there was a much higher acceptance rate for people in mechanical engineering than in the English department. So if you would, this is now a graph from the reading that you guys had to do. On the x-axis, on the horizontal, you have the percentage of women applicants. So the dots represent different departments now. Instead of just 6, now these are all the departments. I think they had 80 departments in there at Berkeley at the time. So the dots or the squares, forget about the size of the squares for a moment. That's just how big those departments are. But those squares, basically, the location on them, the further you go to the right, the more female applicants you have in that department, right? And now the y-axis or the vertical axis tells you how many of the people got admitted in general in that department, out of all of the applications that this particular department got, right? And there you see, when now there's a dot higher on this axis. So this dot very high up, with around 90, that means 90% of the people who applied to this department got admitted to that department. Right? But there's one department which is really tough, where only around 7% of the people who applied to the department actually got admitted to that department. And now you see this relationship between females applying to more of these departments. Now what you see here is this is sort of a regression line fitted into this. Essentially, don't worry too much about it, what it is. Essentially, it's really just finding this line that would bestly, in the best possible way, represent this association that we have there. And the way you do this, you kind of try to put a line in there so that the difference between this line and this dots is minimal. That's essentially ordinarily square. If you come across that, I think Owen is going to teach you this kind of stuff. But that's all there is. There's no magic. It's really just, I don't know, it's a little more complicated how you get to that, but at the end this line is fitted so that the distance from this line to those observation points is minimal. But there you here from this graph you get that females tend to apply more to departments where the admission rate is lower. And for us now, why am I bringing this up here? Because that's an example of where we confuse ecological or this macro or this group level correlation with individual or micro level correlation. Just because something correlates on a group level does not mean it correlates on an individual level as well. Just because a team is good, that doesn't mean that one player in that team is good, that every player in that team is good. Just because people with glasses generally might be more intelligent, doesn't mean that a person who comes along who has glasses on is more intelligent. Just because private schools, tend to produce students who are more successful in life afterwards, doesn't mean that when a friend of yours comes along and says, I'm at private school, that you'd say, okay, this guy is now very, very clever. He's going to be very successful. So that's an example of the ecological fallacy, where you now have these, where we made the mistake of at the first instance, we only had data about this higher level, and implicitly we would have made this mistake to say something about individual single female applicants. Basically, we mixed up the units of analysis. But I have another example which hopefully makes this even clearer. So this is now an example about literacy rate, or literacy, like how many people cannot read. It's a sad thing, but a lot of people still can't read. And there is this paper, again, this is sort of like real stuff. So this is this is our best, American Sociological Review is currently our best journal in sociology. So if you want to, go down the academic route and get a job at an Ivy League university in the States in a way, this is where you need to publish. It's very clear, it's very straightforward. This is sort of like where our best stuff ends up in the American Sociological Review and the American Journal of Sociology. And there's this paper, also now it's a little dated, from the 1950s. Robinson, he computed the illiteracy rate and the proportion of the population born outside the US for each of the states in the 1930 census. So essentially, what this guy did, he looked at number of immigrants, and he looked at how many people can read in a state. Yeah? The key area is that this analysis, or that the unit of analysis, were states. Yeah? So basically, the guy looks at all the 50 states, looks at how many immigrants live there, or what is the share of immigrants, and then he also looks at how many people cannot read in these states. Yeah? And that's sort of what he finds. So then he finds that there is this, we call this a correlation, or negative correlation here of minus 0.53. Basically what it says is that in those states where more migrants live, the illiteracy rate is lower. Yeah? Or put it in other words, in those states where more migrants live, more people can read. Yeah? But this is an analysis at the group level. You know, we have states here now. This is sort of the unit of analysis, and it's not individuals. And the fallacy would be to now draw a conclusion about individuals, because you could now say, based on this data, okay, well, in states where more immigrants live, more people can read. And then somebody comes along, and you could perfectly spin a story around that. Say, okay, well, maybe migrants, maybe it's sort of highly educated people that move around, yeah, and that's sort of how they end up there, and that's sort of why it goes up. Yeah? So it's perfectly fine, would be a perfectly reasonable explanation. And then somebody comes along and says he's a migrant, and say, okay, well, you have a higher chance to be able to read well than somebody who was not a migrant. Yeah? But that would be a fallacy. And here you actually see it. So when you actually take exactly the same data, and when you look more closely, when you look at individuals, the correlation between being a migrant and illiteracy was not negative anymore. It was actually positive. Yeah? Meaning that migrants actually, they have a higher chance of being illiterate, not being able to read. But at the state level, we had an opposite relationship. Yeah. Again, we have a paradox here. Yeah, we have a paradox here. And why do we have a paradox? Because again, we sort of mixed up our levels of analysis, and so it seems immigrants are more illiterate than Americans at the individual level. At the same time, illiteracy is higher in states where fewer immigrants live. So, a single individual immigrant has a higher chance to not be able to read, right? But when you go to the states where most immigrants live, there, actually, compared to all the other states, you have the fewest people who can't read. How can that be? The solution is very straightforward here. Immigrants tend to settle in states where the Americans are more literate. Yeah? They tend to stay, I don't know, back in the days it was like they tended to go to the East Coast or to the West Coast, and the literacy rates were just higher in those states to begin with. So it was nothing about the individuals. Actually, if you would have taken them out, the difference would have been even more pronounced between the I don't know, those ocean states and the states in the middle. So the reasons why states with fewer immigrants are more illiterate was not because of the immigrants, but because of the Americans who already lived there. But again, we sort of mixed up these different layers of analysis. On the one side, states with immigrants and literacy rate in these states, and at the individual level, we actually had being an immigrant and reading skills of an immigrant. The story is, or the key to remember, you cannot draw from the one on the other, or the other way around. Right? That's sort of the problem. That's sort of where the mistake comes into play. So I have one, again, we sort of messed up our units of analysis, what we're actually looking at. I have a third example for this, for the ecological fallacy. It's about death penalties. Again, this might sound familiar to you. And again, it's sort of from a paper, a little more recent, but still dated a little. Again, from the American Sociology. These are the kind of things that people write, and I don't know, that I do when I don't teach stuff. I don't know, not that particularly about this topic, but similarly, I don't know. These would be the kind of findings that I would then, I don't know, try to find out, or what is it, and then I publish about it, I write about it, I hope to get it published. So in this case, this guy looked at the effects of racial characteristics on whether individuals convicted of homicide, murder, receive the death penalty. and he looked at 326 defendants who were recorded as being indicted for homicide in 20 Florida counties in the 1970s. Yeah? So this is a story where now you actually see, hopefully you'll get from that it's actually very important to be very clear about that, because this can be not just very touchy, but we can make really wrong conclusions here. And here we would make a claim about racial discrimination, while in fact there might be none, right? Or the other way around. We would think there's no racial discrimination, but in fact there is. Yeah? Why? Because we made the mistake of the ecological fallacy, because we didn't get our level sorted out. So let's look at that. So the example is the following. Function is following. We have these 200 and something folks, and some of them are white, some of them are black. And when we look at the percentage of this, it seems that whites actually get sentenced to death more often than blacks. Yeah? That's just, again, sort of the fraction of that, 19 divided by 141, and the same thing for the number of black defendants. So this is sort of the people that we got there. But now let's separate this. Now let's again go one layer deeper. Yeah? Now let's look at things separately. One where the victim was white and one where the victim was black. Yeah? So we have kind of these perpetrators, and let's see who they killed. Did they kill a white person or did they kill a black person? And then we look at whether they were sentenced to death or not. And when we look at white victims, so now remember, now we look at the subset of those folks who kind of killed a white person. And now we look at themselves, whether they are white and black. And then we look at how many of them got sentenced to death. And now you see that now 17.5% of the blacks who killed a white person were sentenced to death, while only 12.5% of the white people who killed a black person who killed a white person were sentenced to death. So now it seems like, okay, black people get sentenced to death more often for when they kill white people. Let's look at black victims. Well, first of all, I don't know, it's kind of just, you already see, I don't know, racial differences here in terms of that when the victim was white, people get sentenced to death more often than when the victim was black. But that's a whole other story. But now actually what we're interested in, so now we actually look at this subset, and now, out of those white people who killed a black person, nobody got sentenced to death. While out of those black people who killed a black person, 5.8% were sentenced to death. So when we put these things together, now it looks like in both cases, black people get sentenced to death more often. Yeah? But our original data suggested that white people get sentenced to death more often. Again, we have a paradox. So what is sort of the paradox here? Well, the paradox is it seems that whites get sentenced to death more often than blacks, when we look at the total population. But when splitting the data up according to race of the victim, basically we go one level deeper. In both cases, blacks get sentenced to death more often than whites. How can we explain this? Well, it's relatively straightforward when you know it. Whites, or at least at the time, whites tend to kill other whites. And killing whites is more likely to result in the death penalty than killing blacks. So from the raw data, you would say there's hardly any racial discrimination happening here. Maybe whites get sentenced to death a little more often. But now actually I showed you the lower level analysis. Then you actually see, okay, well actually blacks do get sentenced to death more often than whites. And the reason why this is masked is because black people tended to kill black people, and in general, and white people tended to kill white people, and killing a white person generally tended to result more often in a death penalty than killing a black person. So, but again, when we look at that, here we mix up again two things. At the higher level, we look at all whites who commit crime and the death penalties for whites, and the lower thing, you have a single white criminal and the chances to get sentenced to death. So now you see, hang on, you thought, okay, maybe from the one I should be able to draw on the other, at the lower level. But hopefully now you got that you cannot necessarily do that. Yeah. I have some more stuff about social dynamics. Let me briefly cover that, because now we kind of talked about how you can make mistakes by when you have data about the group, the higher level, right? And then you make the mistake of saying something about the individuals down there. And I think it also works in the other way around, that when we know about isolated individuals, we cannot necessarily draw a conclusion about the population at the end of the day. And this is stuff that I come back much more later on, especially when we talk about social inequality and segregation. I can show you that even when individuals want to live in a highly integrated world, we can still end up collectively in a highly segregated world. Why? Because of social dynamics that come into play. And the story is because 1 plus 1 is not equals 2. Sometimes it's more than that. You know the thing. Have sometimes collective intelligence, and there's no master plan, but still something occurs here, right? So somehow the whole is different from the sum of the parts. These bees interact with each other somehow, and at the end something emerges that maybe none of them actually thought about. It's a fascinating field of study because you can apply this equally well to people too. How collectively, sometimes people don't like to get that, that how collectively we do something that individually we couldn't. But when you think about bees and ants, it actually makes a lot of sense. There you actually see that. There you see how social dynamics actually really matter. And in society, we often have that too. So when you see, for example, how people walk through the city center, so like this one dude I was working for, he looked at pedestrian flows, how people walk through the city center and how they kind of find routes and stuff like that. And how they're sort of influenced by other people around them, and then they kind of go in this direction, in that direction. And you have amazing patterns emerging there. Nobody would ever think about that, but when you take the bird's eye view, you see that. You see these things emerging. And we'll talk more about this whole idea of emergence in a while. But collective intelligence, sometimes 1 plus 1 is also smaller than 2, and this is sort of where this idea of the tragedy comes into play. Just very briefly, because I want to talk about something else next time. Tragedy of the commons is really when we have first of all, we have the commons. What are the commons? The common is something that, we own collectively, or nobody owns, like the fresh air, or the sea, who owns the sea? Or you have something like grazing land, and this is sort of where the tragedy of the commons comes into play. You have these open fields. In some countries they have it actually, it's explicitly stated that it kind of belongs to everybody. In Sweden, where I lived before I came here, it's called the Allmende. It's sort of like this place that, that nobody has a particular right for it. So now we have the commons, something like a collective good, and then we have a tragedy. What is a tragedy? Well, the tragedy is that, that's sort of this paper that Gary Hardin wrote. It's in the further readings for you to check out if you're interested in that. So basically, farmers that kind of use this collective land, they will have the individual incentive to maximize grazing there. So they will send as many sheep there as possible. But if everybody does, so every single individual has the incentive to kind of get the most out of this collective thing. But collectively, we still fuck it up then. Because then not only is all the grass gone, but at the end, all the grazing land is gone, and then every single individual has less than they would have had if they would have all stick to, some ratio in the first instance. So that's sort of what we call the tragedy of the common, when you have like different things, the individual and the collective interest going against each other, and this sort of what we call social dilemma and stuff. But I don't want to, talk too much about this. It's a very interesting field. Game theory is very much about these kind of things, and it's sort of like this revelation that people had that what we observe at the collective level is not necessarily what individuals want. Hopefully you got today that, even when you look at how individuals are, you cannot necessarily draw conclusions about the collective, and the other way around, the ecological fallacy, when you have the collective, you cannot draw conclusions about the individuals necessarily. So stay at this level with your analysis. Reading Hedstrom and Svedberg, the introduction chapter to this famous book called Social Mechanisms. See you next week.